the Tudor and 17th century experience here in August 2020. I was going to do Tudor salads today, but it's been incredibly hot and dry here in Norfolk the last few weeks, so all my precious herbs have died on me. So in order to keep it authentic, which is very important to me, we are going to focus on something else, plums. And what I'm going to do now is I'll take you to my very old orchard and I'll tell you more about the history of the plums and all its cousins to do with Tudor history. See you there. The earliest known data of plums puts them into China roughly about 450 BC. The European plum, the Prunus domestica, is believed to have been discovered around 2000 years ago in what is Eastern Europe today, possibly somewhere also at the Caspian Sea. Others say the plum was carried to Western Europe by the Duke of Anjou as he returned from Jerusalem at the close of the Fifth Crusade, which was around 1198 to 1204, I believe. But we do know that in ancient Rome already 300 varieties of plums were mentioned and known. We've come to my orchard, which is believed to be about 100 years old, possibly a bit older. It has apples, pears, plums and other fruit. And here we've come to stand by my plum tree. It is clear that plums have been one of the first fruits to be domesticated by humans. Wild plums have flourished in hedgerows throughout the Old World, and the domestic plum we eat today descends from a numerous of sources. The plum is closely related to the apricot and the peach too, as well as the cherry. The name plum is derived from the Old English plum with E at the end. At the Bodleian Library in Oxford, there is a lovely early 1500s picture of a plum tree under the MS Ashmole 1504. It's worth checking that out. It's absolutely beautiful, as you can see. In 1542, William Turner is one of the first Tudors to mention the plum. In his work, The Names of Herbs, he basically lists the plums' names in Greek, French and German. Right, here we have a nice bowl of plums and gages, damsons and bullies, for you to see the difference. Now they come in all sorts of colours, as you clearly can see, in dark purple, blue, yellow, green, red, and shapes: big, smaller, round, more oval. The difference is that the plum and the gages are fairly sweet and juicy in their taste, and traditionally have always been eaten fresh. The bullies here, the wild form, and the slightly bigger but still smaller than the plum, the damson, both of these generally have been used traditionally in cookery and more so in preserving, because they are not really sweet enough to eat raw, but make perfect preserving material. And here we have the prunes, the dried forms of the plum. It was really the French that elevated the status of the plum in the 16th century by establishing a trade to England in 2 of their own varieties. The one that's important is the damask prune, a very sweet kind that was dried and sold at the grocers. Plums were also eaten by the sailors on the Mary Rose, which sank in July 1545. About 100 plum stones were recovered from the shipwreck and can still be seen in the museum today. Plums make occasional appearances in upper-class cookery books of the 16th century, in particular in England. Mostly in forms of fruit mousses, tarts and pies, and we are later going to recreate one of them. To English physicians, the plum was a cold and moist fruit that hindered the digestion and recommended the plum as a laxative. So not all good news. The Elizabethan herbalist John Gerard was very proud to have over 60 plum varieties and some very rare ones in his London garden. In his Herbal, which was first published in 1597, this is a slightly later edition of 1633, he does write a very nice account about the plum. Now let me just very quickly show you some of the woodcuts. Now you are familiar with this one, you've seen that earlier on the video about the damson, and there's another one coming up later on the sloe tree. But may I just quickly point out some of the description here. He does point out that wild plums grow in most hedges through England, and further down here under the temperature and virtues, he does confirm his fellow contemporaries with them that the plum moistens and cools but yields onto the body very little nourishment, and the same, nothing good at all. So he really is not impressed about the taste and the virtues of the plum. He also bemoans that they rot quickly, and we can even confirm that now. They do not keep well. And he also mentions that the plum's juice putrefies the body, which sounds terrifying, doesn't it? He prefers the dried variety, and he also prefers the prunes because they are healthier in his opinion and they keep better. However, the Italian food writer Giacomo Castelvetro tells us later in the early 17th century that plums are indeed very healthy, and they are actually better eaten fresh than dried. And he advises that they should be eaten during meals and not afterwards, as the English tend to do. His earlier countryman Platina in the 15th century states that the use of plums before a meal, if it's used in moderation, moves the bowels, tempers the bile, and offers pleasure to the thirsty. He also recommends to pickle the plums and to store them in honey, but to make sure that they do not touch each other. The damson is a subspecies of the plum and thought to have arrived in Europe from Damascus in Syria about pre-Christian times, and was most likely introduced by the Romans to England. Damson stones have been found in York, dating to possibly the Anglo-Saxon period. Damsons, as we've said earlier, are smaller and slightly ovoid in shape, mostly, and generally less sweet than plums. They are, as a tree, much hardier and are generally used for cooking. And because they are hardier than the plums, they have often been used traditionally in orchards to protect less hardy trees from wind, and planted mostly commercially north of Norfolk. Plum trees were grown in many Tudor gardens. However, serious cultivation of plum varieties did not start until the 17th century, mostly by John Tradescant being one of the first to actively do so. The majority of damsons are dark blue to purple in colour, but there are some, especially mentioned in the 1620s, that are now very rare and are forms of white damson with green or yellow skin. Damsons were also very popular as a gift by the people from the home counties, so Kent and all the counties around London, to give to their king or queen while they were in progress. They were gathered in the wild and then delivered to the royal palaces. Shakespeare too refers to the damson plums in at least 4 plays. In Henry IV, Act 3, Scene 3, Falstaff says, "There's no more faith in thee than in a stewed prune," because prunes were sometimes associated with brothels, but their popularity declined slowly in the 16th century in favour of raisins. The Mirabelle or the cherry plum is a cultivar group of the plum and is identified by its small oval shape and its striking red or dark yellow colour. Sadly, I do not have any in my orchard, so we have to refer to a picture instead. The Boleyn here is a variety of the plum and often referred to as the wild plum, especially during Tudor times. It is much smaller than the plum and round in shape. They can be blue, purple, red, yellow, green, and ripen generally much later than the plum. In Britain that can be anything in October and November, so late. It is possible that the Boleyn here is also generally native to Great Britain, where the plum is not. In Tudor England, the Boleyn was also cultivated and a familiar sight in many gardens, but gradually they did fall out of favour as larger and sweeter types emerged. The black Boleyn, as this one, are found wild growing in the woods. The white Boleyn has small yellowish fruit with a greenish flesh, and a very old one by the name of Crixes, probably originating in Anglo-Saxon creek, was grown in large quantities here in Norfolk right up to the 19th century. Boleys are generally only used for fruit preserves, and the tart Boleyn was an import from France known as the prunella, which was a dried and destoned form and packaged in little wooden boxes and then sold for banqueting treats. Another cousin of the plum is the sloe. It's the smallest of all of them, grows wild, but won't be ripe before November, sometimes even later than that. So I can't show you one just yet, it's too early in the year, but I leave you with a lovely picture of John Gerard's sloe from 1597. Right, you've seen my orchard, you've seen my plums and damsons and heard all about the history behind them, but I guess now starts the really exciting part. Let's head over to my kitchen and get cooking. I hope you're going to come with me. Right, welcome back to my kitchen and to the fun of cooking Tudor recipes. Before we start cooking, let me just tell you something about today's recipe, the author of the recipe, and some of the cookery pots that people used to use in a typical Tudor kitchen. First of all, our recipe today is called To Make Tarts of Prunes, and it is taken from a cookery book called The Good Housewife's Jewel, and it was published in 1585 by a man called Thomas Dawson. Now, we know very little about Thomas because he only wrote 4 books and that was it. So we don't know when he was born or when he died, but we know he was active between 1585, his first book, and 1610, his last book. This is obviously a copy of the original one, but you can buy a modern reprint which looks like that, just in case you are interested. Now, the recipe itself is typical of its time, late Elizabethan, which is basically a transition from the medieval cuisine to the modern cuisine. Now, how can we tell? This is the first time when cookery books are being published on a fairly regular basis, and much more important, geared at women. For the first time ever are these cookery books, housewives, geared at women, but not just any woman. It was the ladies of the house, the ladies, the women who could read and who could afford a book like that and could afford the ingredients. Right. Next significance is that the recipes are beginning to start showing more instructions, like do this, do that, cook it until it's done, take a handful. That is totally new, because before all the recipes would not show any of that. Anyway, have a look at that very short recipe which we are going to do today. Note the spelling. And there are a few things I need to explain. It says here, put your prunes into a pot. Right, we can use prunes, which are, as you might remember, the dried form of plums, but we can use fresh plums or damson, that's fine, into the pot. And put in red wine, got that here, or claret wine, which was also a red wine, and a little fair water. Ooh, a little. Here's our measurement. Very rare. Fair water. Why fair water? Why would they put that? That's to make sure that whoever was going to prepare the recipe knew to get the water from a reliable source, so somewhere clean rainwater or somewhere they knew was reliable. And then it goes on, stir them now and then, and they be boiled enough. Here's your instruction. You just simply boil the plums until they're done, basically until they're soft. And then it goes on, put them into a bowl and strain. What does strain mean? It basically means that they took a colander, one like that, holes, muslin. They put the mash, the fruit mash that's been boiled, in here, and then use a spoon or something to push it through, and whatever comes out the other end is what you are going to use. And that process is called strain, and then it says strain them with sugar, cinnamon and ginger. Again, no, absolutely no indication how much. So it's up to you how much you want to add, more or little, sweeter or not so sweet. Anyway, before we go, very quickly note the ingredients. We want plums, sugar, cinnamon, ginger, little bit of water, red wine, and some either toast or stale water, stale bread, whatever. Now, when we look at the recipe again, you might have noticed that it does tell us exactly what to do with the fruit, but the title says a tart. Where's the tart? It doesn't tell us anything about the tart. Very, very typical, because you had to have the experience. You had to know that there are similar recipes, and other similar recipes might have actually pointed out that you could use what you produce here, this fruit mousse, and put it into a pre-baked pie dish, or like there is an Italian recipe of the similar time period which uses it on top of a sop, basically a piece of toasted or fried bread. Now, the Italians would have fried it in olive oil. The English used stale bread instead. I leave it to you whether you go for the stale bread, the toasted, or the fried in olive oil. I know what I would use. I've tried them all. I go Italian. Anyway, I am now off to wash the plums and take the stones out, because, yeah, it's not being mentioned, but yes, we do need to take the stones out. The author of the recipe knew that anybody who would do this in his time would know. They don't need to be told it's the stone taken out. So let me do that, and I'll meet you when I've got them prepared and I'm ready to put them into the cookery pot. Right, I've now washed my plums. I took the stone out, even though the recipe doesn't specifically call for it. I have used a mixture of plums and gauges, because it's more important that they have the more or less the same degree of ripeness rather than it being the same color. So in they go into my pot, and I'll add the red wine. That goes in, and I shall let that boil now according to the recipe until it's enough, and it will be enough when they are really nice and soft. That can take anything between 5 and 10 minutes. It really depends on what plum you're using. Is it still very hard, or is it already very soft? What type you're using it. If you use, for instance, the prunes, they take relatively little, but they will need a little bit of fair water because they're drier. We're using fresh fruit. We therefore need less fluid to boil it in, so that's why I have skipped the fair water in this particular one. So that will now just boil away until it's done. I will keep checking it, stirring it, checking it every now and then, as it says in the recipe. So I do follow it. But what we could do in the meantime is I show you how to prepare stale toast. Right. While our plums are boiling away happily, I show you how to make sops. Now, sops is very traditional for Tudor and medieval England. All over Europe, they all use the same, and they usually put that as the bottom to another dish. In England, what we did is we had a slice of stale bread, and then we would cut the rind off. We didn't want that. We wanted just a nice white stuff in the middle. And this would then be your sop. However, mine isn't really stale. I generally don't let them go stale. So you can cheat by either putting it in the oven a little bit to dry out, or in your toaster, or go Italian and fry it in olive oil. Right, my plums have been boiled long enough now. They're nice and soft, so we can take them off the heat. I've got a bowl here, I've got a colander, and what I'm doing is now just putting some of that soft mixture here, and then I just basically press it through the holes. It's a bit tedious, time consuming to do this, and because it is time consuming, but this is the way how they did it. I think you could cheat by using a blender. Of course you can, and you are certainly allowed to do that, but I personally try and keep it as authentic as possible. So what I've done is, not to bore you for the next 25 minutes doing this, I've prepared some earlier. So I'm going to move this over here, and you'll see what you end up with is actually a fairly smooth texture, but not as smooth as it would be if I used a blender. Okay, and into this mixture here, I now mix in some grated ginger. There's your ginger root, how they would have purchased it, but obviously they themselves would have had to grind it in a mortar. So I'll put in a generous amount. The Tudors did like their ginger. It was part of showing off how wealthy they were, because obviously ginger had to be imported. Then I've got some of the cinnamon. This is how they would have bought it from the pharmacy, and again they would have had to grind it themselves. Cinnamon, very popular Tudor spice. Now, why did they use those spices? It's a very good question. It's not just for the taste, and it's not just to show off how wealthy you were. It's also to make the potentially dangerous plum, which, remember, Gerard wasn't very taken by it because it was cool and it was moist. It doesn't sound tempting, does it? But by cooking it and by adding hot spices, you basically made it healthier, because their system was all based on the 4 humours. Hard for us to relate to, but they really believed that any body was made up of 4 fluids, and you were only healthy if they were balanced. And it depended on your gender and your age and where you lived and what you ate and what you did, whether you were more of a hot person or more inclined to be cold. Now, as a woman, I would have been considered to be generally cold, based on being a woman, of course. And because of my age, I probably would have been considered to be dry or drier than a young person. And in order to balance that out, I would have had to eat moist stuff and cool stuff. You can see how it works. Anyway, so somebody who was considered to be hot, young men for instance, yeah, of course, would have had to balance that with spices that were considered hot and the cooking process also hot to level it out and make it more consumer friendly. Easy, isn't it? Anyway, sugar goes in as well, and sugar was also considered a spice. Very expensive. That's why you find sugar in every single recipe that was geared at the wealthy, because if you had sugar, you had money, and if you had money, you had sugar. So the more you put in, the better. And in this recipe, it's actually very important that you use a very fine sugar, because you're not cooking it anymore. It stays like it is now. And if you don't use very fine sugar, it will basically not dissolve, and you don't want sugar lumps in it. So your mixture is ready now. Lovely and sweet, fruity, and with the spices added, it really has a lovely flavor. All that's left to do is now you take your toasted piece of English stale bread. Well, I toasted it, I didn't let it go stale. Put it on a nice wooden plate. Actually, this is an example of what the plates would have looked on a Mary Rose. Just a little interest fact on the side. Okay, toast on here. I also put down some fine sugar just to make it more presentable. And now all you need to do is add this still warm, lovely mixture. Let it go all over. And now we come to the fun part. The fun part is to decorate it. Food decoration was so important in Tudor England, as it is today. If you go to a 5-star restaurant, it's all about the presentation, and it was for Tudors. So you can use basically sugar. They did love sprinkled sugar on everything. So what you take is a fine sieve, and then you basically just sprinkle it around like that. Or you can use the spices themselves. They did that, especially with cinnamon. They liked adding that. Or you can use fresh flowers or dried flowers, but you must make sure that they are Tudor authentic. I have seen modern cooks using just any flowers. No, they need to be obviously food safe, and Tudor period ones are, for instance, in season now, also very important. Everything has to be seasonal and authentic. Is rose petals. Fresh rose petals. Obviously make sure that there are no insects hiding it, so you sprinkle that over. That's always a lovely effect and so easy. You don't need to be particularly skilled in decorating it. Or here we have corn flour. These days corn flour comes in all sorts of colors, but the Tudors would have only known the blue corn flour. You can dry that very easily. It dries and does not lose its color. It's fantastic stuff. And look how you transform instantly a fairly bland looking dish into a splash of color. And color, that's what it was all about in Tudor England. I also sometimes add some other ingredients as food decorations. For instance, here I have sliced prune, which sometimes can give just that little extra touch. But do make sure when you use yours that it actually is all Tudor authentic. So here we have the English version. Here we have the Italian fried in olive oil version. And here we have the little pie version. Same recipe, but it could be any of these. It's not specified. All three are contemporary, authentic to the period. Other authors of recipes of that time have used this particular fruit mousse in these ways. So take your pick, take your choice, and possibly have it either as a snack or breakfast. My family has had it for breakfast, and my husband is nodding. It's really nice. Sets you up for the day. Right, so that's it for today. I don't know yet what we'll do next month in September, but again, it will be something that is authentic and seasonal. So my guess will be apples will be ready, pears will be ready. So it will be along those lines. But in order to find out what it will be, you will have to come back next month, September. Hope to see you then. Bye.